The scream never came. That was the strange part. Clara Whitfield opened her mouth to call for help, and nothing came out except a thin, useless breath, because the hand around her wrist had already tightened enough to stop her thinking clearly. "You've teased me long enough," Edmund Blackwood said, his voice thick with brandy, his grip pulling her deeper into the shadow of the garden hedge, away from the lanterns and the music and the 80 guests who had no idea anything was wrong. A man gets tired of waiting for a woman to notice what's obvious. "Let go of me." Clara kept her voice low, aware even now, even with panic climbing her throat, that a raised voice would draw exactly the kind of attention that would ruin her faster than anything Edmund was doing to her arm. He didn't let go. He laughed instead, low and unpleasant, and stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the brandy on every word. Clara had spent the whole evening avoiding this exact man, moving from conversation to conversation, keeping her mother within reach, and it had worked for 3 hours. It had taken him exactly 1 moment alone near the hedges to undo all of it. She twisted her wrist, hard, and felt his fingers dig in tighter instead of loosening. "Somebody will see," she said. "Nobody's looking," Edmund said. "That's rather the point of a hedge, Miss Whitfield." A voice cut through the dark before Clara could answer. "Clara, there you are." She had never in her life been so relieved to hear anyone say her name. Duke Nathaniel Everleigh stepped around the hedge with the unhurried calm of a man who owned every lawn within sight, though his eyes, when they landed on Edmund's hand still locked around Clara's wrist, held none of that calm at all. "Let her go," Nathaniel said. "It was not a request." Edmund released her wrist so quickly it was almost comic, stepping back with the practiced smoothness of a man used to covering his own tracks. "Your Grace, we were only talking." "It didn't look like talking." "A misunderstanding, nothing more." Edmund's smile was thin, calculating, already rebuilding the story he would tell at the card tables tomorrow. "Miss Whitfield and I have an understanding, you see. Perhaps she failed to mention it." Clara's stomach dropped. There was no understanding. There had never been an understanding, only 3 dances at 2 separate parties and a man who had decided, somewhere in his own mind, that polite conversation counted as a claim. "There is no understanding," Clara said, finding her voice at last. "Mr. Blackwood is mistaken." "Am I?" Edmund's eyes flicked toward Nathaniel, weighing something, calculating something. "Careful how you tell this story, Miss Whitfield. A woman alone with a man behind a hedge at night, without a chaperone in sight. People will draw their own conclusions regardless of what either of us claims actually happened." It was a threat wrapped in a smile, and Clara understood it instantly. Whatever Edmund said tomorrow, whatever version of tonight reached the drawing rooms of the county, it would not favor her. A woman's reputation broke easily and mended slowly, if it mended at all, and Edmund knew that better than most men, because he had likely broken more than one before her. Nathaniel understood it too. Clara watched the understanding cross his face in the space of a single breath, watched him make a decision faster than she could follow. He closed the distance between them, took her face gently in his hands and kissed her. It was not soft. It was not romantic, not in the way a first kiss was supposed to be, according to every novel Clara had ever read in secret. It was deliberate, public enough that anyone glancing toward the hedge from the terrace would see it clearly, loud enough in its intention that no one watching could mistake it for anything but a claim of his own, stronger and older and far more dangerous to cross than Edmund's. When he pulled back, his hand still resting against her cheek, he spoke directly to Edmund, his voice carrying easily across the small clearing. "Miss Whitfield is engaged to me, Mr. Blackwood. Has been for some weeks now, though we hadn't yet made it public. I'd be careful, if I were you, about the story you choose to tell tomorrow." Edmund's face went through several expressions in quick succession: calculation, then disbelief, Then something colder that Clara didn't have time to name before he forced a stiff bow and walked away, disappearing back toward the lanterns and the music without another word. Clara stood frozen, her cheeks still warm where Nathaniel's hand had been, her mind unable to catch up with what had just happened. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I did actually." Nathaniel stepped back, putting proper distance between them now that Edmund was gone, though his eyes remained sharp, alert, scanning the darkness beyond the hedge as though he expected another threat to emerge from it. "He was building a story that would have ended your season before it started. This one, at least, ends with your reputation intact. By inventing an engagement." "By inventing an engagement," he agreed. "One we can quietly dissolve in a month or two, once the gossip moves on to someone else's scandal." It sounded simple when he said it. Clara wanted to believe it would be that simple. "Thank you," she said, because it was true, even if gratitude felt strange sitting next to the leftover panic still humming through her chest. "For stepping in. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Nathaniel's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You should return to the party before your absence is noticed. I'll follow separately in a few minutes. It wouldn't do for us to walk back in together looking as though something happened." "Something did happen. Something that stays between the three of us for now," Nathaniel said. "Go on, Clara. Your mother will be looking for you." She went, smoothing her dress, forcing her breathing steady, walking back toward the lanterns with the particular composure that years of careful upbringing had taught her to summon on command. But her mind stayed behind her in the dark, replaying the moment his hands had framed her face, the deliberate certainty in his kiss, the way he had said her name like it belonged to him already. By the time she reached the terrace, her mother, Margaret Whitfield, was already moving toward her with the sharp, searching look she reserved for moments when she suspected her daughter had done something worth investigating. "Where have you been? I lost sight of you nearly 20 minutes ago." "Walking," Clara said. "The garden air was pleasant." Her mother's eyes narrowed slightly, but before she could press further, a ripple of whispered conversation moved through the nearby guests, quiet at first, then louder, spreading across the terrace like water finding cracks in stone. Clara didn't need to hear the words clearly to know what they were saying. Edmund Blackwood, apparently unable to hold his tongue for even the length of a short walk back to the party, was already telling anyone who would listen that the Duke of Everleigh had just declared himself engaged to Clara Whitfield, right there in the garden, in front of witnesses. Her mother's hand flew to her chest. "Clara, is this true?" Clara opened her mouth to explain, to correct the story before it grew any larger, and found she had no idea what to say. The truth, that Nathaniel had kissed her only to stop Edmund's threats from taking root, sounded even worse than the rumor itself once she tried to put it into words. And denying it outright, in front of a terrace full of listening ears, would only hand Edmund exactly the opening he needed to tell his own version of the evening instead. "I don't know what to tell you, Mother," Clara said honestly, watching Nathaniel emerge from the darkness of the garden behind her, his expression composed once more, betraying nothing of what had happened only minutes before. He crossed the terrace with unhurried steps, every eye in the vicinity following him, and stopped beside Clara with the easy confidence of a man who had already decided how the rest of this evening would go. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, offering a small, formal bow, "I apologize for the manner in which this news has reached you. I had intended a quieter conversation at a more appropriate hour." Margaret's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. "Your Grace, are you saying that you and my daughter are, in fact?" "Engaged," Nathaniel said smoothly. "Yes." The word landed across the terrace like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through every conversation within hearing distance. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes settle onto her at once, curious, calculating, already reshaping their understanding of who she was, and what her prospects had suddenly become. She looked at Nathaniel, searching his face for some sign of doubt, some flicker of regret at how quickly and how publicly his rescue had solidified into something neither of them had chosen with any real thought behind it. He offered her nothing but calm certainty, the same expression he likely wore while negotiating land disputes or shipping contracts, as though a fabricated engagement to a woman he barely knew required no more effort than any other piece of estate business. But underneath that calm, Clara caught something else, quick and gone before she could be certain she'd seen it at all. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. The lie was only minutes old, and already it had grown too large for either of them to take back easily. Clara understood, standing there on the terrace with her mother's hand gripping her arm and half the county whispering her name, that whatever came next, there was no simple road back to the quiet, unremarkable life she'd had before Edmund Blackwood cornered her behind a hedge. She only hoped Nathaniel understood it too, and that his easy confidence wasn't about to cost them both far more than either of them expected to pay. By morning, the story had traveled farther than either of them could control. Clara sat at the breakfast table, untouched toast growing cold in front of her, while her mother read aloud from a letter that had arrived before the sun had fully risen, sent by an aunt 3 villages away who had somehow already heard the news. "They're calling it the romance of the season," Margaret said, delight warring with disbelief in her voice. "A duke declaring himself in a garden right in front of half the county. Clara, do you understand what this means for your prospects?" "It means a great many people believe something that isn't entirely true," Clara said carefully. Her mother waved the concern away like a fly. "Nonsense. The Duke of Everleigh does not make declarations he doesn't intend to honor. Whatever brought it about, the outcome is the same. You're engaged to one of the wealthiest men in the county." Clara said nothing further, unable to explain the truth without unraveling the very protection Nathaniel had built for her the night before. She excused herself as soon as she reasonably could and walked the long path toward the Everleigh estate, needing to see him, needing to understand exactly how far this lie was expected to stretch before either of them found a way to end it quietly. She found him in his study, a room she had never entered before, lined with ledgers and correspondence and the particular quiet of a house built for serious business rather than social calls. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression told her he had been expecting this visit since the moment he woke. "The story's grown," Clara said without preamble. "My aunt 3 villages away already knows. By tomorrow it will be halfway to London." "I'm aware." Nathaniel set down the letter he'd been reading and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. We should discuss how to manage this properly, now that it's beyond either of our control to stop it quietly." "I don't want to manage a lie, Your Grace. I want to end it before it costs me more than Edmund Blackwood ever could have." "It's already cost you nothing you didn't stand to lose regardless," Nathaniel said, his voice steady, though something behind his eyes suggested the conversation cost him more effort than his tone let on. "Consider the alternative. If I hadn't intervened, Edmund would be the one telling stories about last night, and his version would not have ended with your reputation intact." Clara sat, mostly because her legs had grown tired of standing, and studied him across the desk. "You could correct it now. Tell people it was a misunderstanding, that there's no engagement, that you only meant to frighten Edmund into silence." "I could," Nathaniel agreed. "And within a week, Edmund would resume exactly the campaign he started last night, this time with the added detail that even a duke's protection couldn't be trusted to last, which would make your situation considerably worse than if I'd never intervened at all." Clara hated that his logic made sense. She hated more that she couldn't find a hole in it, not with her mother already writing to relatives, not with the whole county already reshaping its understanding of her future around a kiss that had lasted only seconds and meant, as far as she understood it, nothing at all beyond its immediate purpose. How long then, she asked, before we can end it without drawing suspicion? A month, perhaps two, long enough that the engagement feels genuine rather than convenient, and short enough that neither of us is bound to it any longer than necessary. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly as he said it, though Clara couldn't tell whether the tension came from distaste at the arrangement or something else he wasn't inclined to name. And during those 2 months, we behave as an engaged couple would, attend the appropriate events together, allow ourselves to be seen in each other's company enough that the eventual end of the engagement looks like the natural conclusion of a courtship that simply didn't take, rather than the collapse of something invented in a moment of panic. It sounded reasonable when he laid it out so plainly, each piece fitting into the next with the same precision he likely applied to every decision regarding his estate. But Clara couldn't shake the discomfort of it, the strange sensation of agreeing to perform a relationship for an audience that had no idea it was watching a performance at all. "There's something else," Nathaniel said, before she could voice any further objection. "Edmund Blackwood is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. I've known him since we were boys, and I can tell you with some confidence that last night's humiliation will not simply fade, because a rumor gave him an excuse to save face in front of the party guests." "What do you mean?" "I mean he'll look for another way to reclaim what he believes he lost," Nathaniel said. "Whether that's your reputation or mine or something else entirely, I can't say yet. But I'd ask you to be careful, Clara, more careful than you were last night, walking near a hedge alone." The warning settled uncomfortably in her chest, sharper than she expected given how calmly he delivered it. "You think he means to do something?" "I think a man who nearly ruined a woman's reputation for the crime of declining his attention is not a man who limits himself to gossip when gossip fails to satisfy him." Clara left the estate that afternoon with more questions than she'd arrived carrying, and a low, persistent unease that followed her the entire walk home, settling into her chest like a stone she couldn't quite dislodge. She didn't have to wait long to understand what Nathaniel meant. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Whitfield house, addressed to Clara directly, written in a hand she didn't recognize, though the tone beneath the careful penmanship felt uncomfortably familiar. "I saw what happened behind that hedge," the letter read. "Everyone believes the kiss was the beginning of something. I know better. I know exactly how convenient timing can be, Miss Whitfield, and I intend to remind the county of it piece by piece until your Duke's protection crumbles beneath its own convenient timing." There was no signature, but Clara didn't need one to understand who had sent it. She sat with the letter clutched in her hands for a long while, the quiet dread in her chest sharpening into something closer to fear. Whatever game Edmund Blackwood intended to play next, he had made it clear he wasn't finished, and Clara understood, with a clarity that chilled her more than the letter's words themselves, that this was no longer only about a rumor or a reputation. It was about a man who had decided he would rather destroy something than accept losing it. She brought the letter to Nathaniel the following morning, watching his expression harden as he read it, his hand tightening around the paper until the edges creased beneath his grip. "He's escalating faster than I expected," Nathaniel said quietly. "What does he mean, piece by piece?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out before he decides to show us rather than tell us." Nathaniel folded the letter carefully and set it aside, his eyes meeting Clara's with a seriousness that hadn't been present in their earlier conversation about performing a proper engagement. "From this point forward, I'd ask that you not travel anywhere alone, not to the village, not to visit neighbors, not even in your own garden after dark." You think he'd go that far? Threatening a letter is one thing. But I think a man desperate enough to send an anonymous threat is a man capable of far worse, once threats alone fail to produce the result he wants. Nathaniel's voice carried none of the calm certainty from their earlier conversation about managing the engagement's timeline. This was something rawer, more immediate, the voice of a man recalculating every risk now that the stakes had shifted beneath him. I should have taken his character more seriously from the start. I knew what kind of man he was long before that garden party. I simply didn't expect him to act on it so quickly or so recklessly. Clara felt the ground shifting beneath the careful arrangement they'd built only days before. What had started as a convenient lie to protect her reputation now carried a weight neither of them had anticipated, a danger that made the pretend engagement feel suddenly, uncomfortably real, regardless of how either of them had intended it to begin. "What do we do now?" she asked. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the folded letter resting on his desk, before he finally answered. "Now we make certain he understands exactly how badly this will go for him if he continues down this path. And we make certain you're protected every step of the way, whether he likes the arrangement between us or not." It was not the reassurance Clara had hoped for, not entirely. But there was something steady in the way he said it, something that told her whatever came next, she would not be facing it as alone as she had been behind that hedge 3 nights before. The second letter arrived 5 days later, and this time it was not addressed to Clara alone. It came to Nathaniel's estate, sealed with wax pressed by a signet ring he recognized immediately, the small crest belonging to a family Edmund Blackwood had married into through a cousin's connection years before. There was no attempt at anonymity this time. Edmund had apparently decided that hiding his involvement no longer served his purpose. "Your engagement is built on nothing," the letter read. "I have spoken with 3 men who were near enough to hear the truth of what happened behind that hedge, and each of them is willing to say, under the right encouragement, that Miss Whitfield's honor required no rescue at all, that the entire arrangement was invented for reasons that suit you both rather better than the truth would. Break the engagement quietly, or I will make certain the county hears a version of events considerably less flattering to either of you." Nathaniel read it twice, his expression darkening with each pass before summoning his steward, a steady, unflappable man named Mr. Higgins, who had served the Everleigh estate for over a decade. "Find out which men Edmund Blackwood has been speaking with," Nathaniel said. "I want names, and I want to know exactly what he's offered them to lie." Mr. Higgins nodded and departed without question, the kind of quiet efficiency Nathaniel had come to rely on more than he usually admitted. Clara arrived at the estate that afternoon, summoned by a brief note asking her to come as soon as she was able, and found Nathaniel packing the length of his study with the letter still in hand. "He's threatening to buy false witnesses," she said, once she'd read it herself, her stomach tightening with each word. "People who will say I invited what happened, or worse, that none of it happened the way we've claimed." "He won't succeed," Nathaniel said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he wasn't entirely certain of his own reassurance. Men who accept payment to lie rarely hold their story together under real questioning, but it will take time to prove that, and time is exactly what he's counting on us not having. What happens if he does succeed? If people believe his version instead of ours?" Nathaniel didn't answer immediately, and his silence told Clara more than any careful explanation could have. If Edmund's version took hold, if the county decided the engagement had been fabricated for convenience rather than born from genuine protection, Clara's reputation would suffer twice over, once for the original scandal near the hedge, and again for what would look like a deliberate deception meant to salvage it. "We need proof," Clara said finally. "Something that shows exactly what happened that night, something Edmund can't twist into a different story no matter how many men he pays." "There were no witnesses beyond the 3 of us," Nathaniel said. "That was rather the problem from the start." Clara thought hard, running through every detail of that night, searching for anything they had overlooked. And then, slowly, a memory surfaced, small and easy to dismiss, but persistent enough that she couldn't let it go. "The gardener," she said. There was a gardener trimming the hedges earlier that evening, before the party moved into full swing. I remember passing him on my way to find my mother. If he was still working nearby when Edmund cornered me, he may have seen or heard something. Nathaniel's expression sharpened with cautious hope. Do you know his name? No, but someone on your household staff might, since he was likely hired for the evening rather than employed by my family directly. Mr. Higgins, when consulted, confirmed that the gardening service for the party had come from a firm in the village, and within the hour, a name was produced. A man called Samuel Ferris, employed part-time by several county estates for exactly the kind of seasonal work the garden party had required. Nathaniel rode out that same afternoon to find him, taking Clara along despite his earlier insistence that she remain close to the estate rather than traveling, reasoning correctly that her presence might be the difference between a wary stranger and a willing witness. Samuel Ferris turned out to be a quiet, careful man in his middle years, hesitant at first to discuss anything related to a duke's private business, until Clara explained gently, without exaggeration, exactly what was at stake and why his memory of that evening mattered so much. I remember, Samuel said finally, after a long pause spent studying both their faces. I was finishing the far hedge when I heard raised voices, low ones, the kind people use when they don't want to be overheard. I didn't think much of it at first, figured it was a private conversation not meant for my ears. But then I heard a man's voice get sharper, and a woman's voice sound frightened, and I moved closer without meaning to, just to be sure nothing serious was happening. What did you see? Nathaniel asked. I saw a gentleman holding a lady's wrist far tighter than seemed proper, and I was about to step in myself when another man arrived and put a stop to it. I didn't think it was my place to say anything after that, not with a duke handling matters himself. But I saw it plain enough, if that's what you're asking. Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly that her knees felt unsteady. Would you be willing to say so, if it came to that, if someone questioned what really happened that night? Samuel hesitated, glancing between them, clearly weighing the risk of involving himself in the private business of powerful families against the plain discomfort of having witnessed something he knew wasn't right. I don't much care for lies, he said eventually. If someone's twisting what happened into something uglier than the truth, I'll say what I saw plainly enough, Your Grace. You have my word on that. It was not the full proof they needed, not enough on its own to silence whatever paid testimony Edmund might still produce, but it was something solid, something true, standing directly against whatever fiction Edmund intended to build. They returned to the estate as the light began to fade, Clara's relief tempered by the knowledge that one honest witness, however reliable, might not be enough to outweigh 3 men willing to lie for coin. That relief shattered entirely 3 nights later. Clara had gone to bed early, exhausted from the tension of the preceding week, when a sound outside her window pulled her from sleep. At first she assumed it was only the wind, the ordinary creak of an old house settling into the night. But the second sound was unmistakably deliberate, the careful scrape of something against the outer wall, followed by the soft, unnatural silence of someone trying very hard not to be heard. She sat up in bed, heart hammering, and reached instinctively for the small brass bell kept on her nightstand for summoning the household staff. Before her fingers closed around it, the window latch gave way with a sharp crack, and a gloved hand pushed the frame open from outside. Clara did not hesitate. She rang the bell as hard and as fast as she could manage, the sound shattering the quiet of the house, and scrambled backward off the bed toward the door, screaming for help in a voice that finally worked exactly the way it had failed to work behind that hedge. The intruder, startled by the noise and the sudden commotion of servants stirring throughout the house, abandoned the window and disappeared into the darkness of the garden before anyone reached Clara's room, leaving only a single dropped item behind on the floor beneath the sill. A signet ring, identical in design to the wax seal on Edmund Blackwood's threatening letter. By the time Clara's mother reached her room, pale and frantic, Clara was already sitting rigid on the edge of her bed, the ring clutched tightly in her palm, her whole body trembling with the aftershock of terror that had, for one endless moment, felt entirely too much like the helplessness she'd felt behind that hedge. "Send word to the Everleigh estate immediately," Margaret said to the nearest servant, her voice sharper and steadier than Clara had ever heard it. "Tell His Grace what's happened. Tell him to come at once." Nathaniel arrived before dawn, his composure fractured in a way Clara had not seen from him even during the worst of the threatening letters. He examined the broken window latch himself, turned the ring over carefully in his hands, and when he finally looked at Clara, the anger in his expression was cold enough that she understood, immediately and completely, that whatever restraint he had been showing Edmund Blackwood until now was entirely finished. "This ends tonight," Nathaniel said, "whatever it takes." Clara, still shaking, still holding the memory of that gloved hand forcing her window open, found she had no argument left in her against the fierceness in his voice. She only nodded, understanding at last that the danger threading through this arrangement had moved far beyond rumor and reputation, into something that could have cost her far more than her good name if the bell hadn't been within reach. By morning, the signet ring had been sent to the county magistrate along with a full account of the broken window and the 2 threatening letters that preceded it. Judge Bellamy, a stern man with little patience for members of the gentry who believed their standing placed them above the law, agreed to open a formal inquiry, though he cautioned that a ring alone, without a witness placing it directly on Edmund's hand during the intrusion, would not be enough to secure an arrest. "We need more than a ring," Nathaniel said, packing the length of Judge Bellamy's office while Clara sat quietly beside her mother, still pale from the sleepless night. The man attempted to enter Miss Whitfield's private chambers in the dark. That alone should warrant his arrest, regardless of what further proof we can gather. "It should," Judge Bellamy agreed, "and it will, the moment we have proof strong enough to survive a proper hearing rather than crumble the instant Mr. Blackwood's solicitor stands up to contest it. I understand your urgency, Your Grace, but a mishandled case now could see him walk free entirely, emboldened rather than deterred." The wait that followed felt unbearable to Clara, each day stretching long and tense, every unfamiliar sound outside her window enough to send her heart racing well past midnight. Nathaniel, unwilling to leave her unprotected while the investigation proceeded, arranged for 2 of his most trusted household guards to remain stationed near the Whitfield estate around the clock, a precaution Clara's mother accepted with visible relief, though it did little to fully calm the unease that had settled permanently into Clara's chest. 4 days into the investigation, Mr. Higgins returned from the village with news that shifted everything. "One of the men Edmund approached about false testimony has changed his mind," Mr. Higgins reported, standing before Nathaniel's desk with the careful, measured tone he used whenever delivering information he suspected would matter greatly. "A young clerk named Peter Doyle. He came to me directly, said his conscience wouldn't allow him to go through with the lie Edmund paid him to tell, especially not after hearing about the incident at Miss Whitfield's window. He's willing to speak with the magistrate, provided his own involvement in the earlier scheme isn't treated too harshly." Nathaniel wasted no time arranging the meeting. Peter Doyle, a nervous young man clearly uncomfortable with the weight of what he was about to admit, confirmed before Judge Bellamy that Edmund Blackwood had offered payment for testimony claiming the garden encounter had been staged, invented specifically to manufacture a rescue, and by extension, a convenient engagement. "He said it would only cost me a small lie," Peter admitted, his hands twisting together in his lap. "Said no real harm would come of it, that Miss Whitfield's reputation was already damaged regardless of what I said. But then I heard about someone breaking into her window in the dead of night, and I couldn't square that with a man who claimed he only wanted to protect his own good name. That's not protection. That's someone with far worse intentions. Combined with Samuel Ferris's earlier account and the signet ring recovered beneath Clara's window, Judge Bellamy finally agreed the evidence had grown substantial enough to issue a formal warrant for Edmund Blackwood's arrest, on charges spanning attempted intimidation, solicitation of false testimony, and unlawful entry with clear intent to cause harm. But when the magistrate's men arrived at Edmund's townhouse to execute the warrant, they found the residence empty, his belongings hastily packed, his staff dismissed days earlier under the pretense of extended travel. Edmund Blackwood had disappeared. The news reached Clara and Nathaniel together, delivered by an anxious messenger who had ridden hard from the village to bring word as quickly as possible. Clara felt the fragile relief of the past few days collapse instantly, replaced by a fear sharper than anything she'd felt even during the window intrusion, because a man caught was dangerous, but a man loose, desperate, and out of options was something else entirely. He knew this was coming, Nathaniel said grimly, reading the messenger's account twice over. Someone must have warned him the investigation was closing in. Who would warn him? I don't know yet, but it means he had time to plan an escape rather than simply flee in panic, which tells me he's not finished with whatever he intended to accomplish before he goes to ground entirely. Clara thought immediately of her mother, alone at the estate while she herself remained at Everleigh discussing the investigation's next steps. My mother. If Edmund believes I'm the reason his plans collapsed, he might. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Nathaniel was already calling for horses before she'd fully voiced the fear, and within minutes they were riding hard toward the Whitfield estate. The household guards Nathaniel had stationed there weeks earlier suddenly feeling far too distant a comfort given how quickly everything had shifted. They arrived to find the estate quiet, too quiet, the guards nowhere in sight near the front entrance where they usually kept watch. Clara's heart climbed into her throat as Nathaniel dismounted quickly, drawing a pistol from his saddlebag that Clara hadn't even realized he carried, motioning for her to stay close behind him as they approached the house. The front door stood slightly ajar. Inside, they found one of the household guards slumped against the entrance hall wall, alive but dazed, a fresh bruise darkening along his jaw where he'd clearly been struck from behind before he could raise any alarm. "Where's my mother?" Clara demanded, kneeling beside the guard, her hands trembling as she checked him for further injury. "The study," the guard managed, his voice thick and unsteady. "A man came to the door, said he had urgent business with Mrs. Whitfield regarding the investigation. I let my guard down for only a moment, and he struck me before I understood what was happening." Nathaniel was already moving toward the study, pistol raised, his expression carved from the same cold fury Clara had seen the morning after the window intrusion, though sharper now, more immediate, driven by the very real possibility that Edmund Blackwood was somewhere inside this house at this exact moment, cornered and desperate enough to do something none of them could yet predict. Clara followed, her fear for her mother outweighing every instinct telling her to stay back and let Nathaniel handle whatever waited beyond the study door. The door was closed but not locked. Nathaniel pushed it open slowly, and the scene inside stopped Clara's breath entirely. Margaret Whitfield stood near the far wall, pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Edmund Blackwood stood several feet away, disheveled in a way that suggested days spent traveling in haste, a small blade held loosely in one hand, though his posture carried more desperation than confidence. "Ah," Edmund said, his eyes flicking toward the doorway as Nathaniel and Clara entered. "The Duke arrives just in time to watch everything he built come apart." "Put the knife down, Edmund," Nathaniel said, his voice low and controlled despite the pistol steady in his grip. "This ends now, one way or another." "It ends when I say it ends," Edmund snapped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how far this had strayed from any plan he might have originally imagined. You've taken everything from me. My reputation, my prospects, and now a warrant hangs over my head because of a servant's loose tongue and a gardener who couldn't mind his own business." "You did that to yourself," Clara said, stepping slightly forward despite Nathaniel's hand rising instinctively to keep her back. "Every choice that brought you to this room was yours, Edmund, not mine, not his." Edmund's grip on the blade tightened, his eyes darting between Clara and Nathaniel with the frantic calculation of a man rapidly running out of options he could live with. For a long, unbearable moment, no one in the room moved, the tension stretched taut enough that Clara could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Then Nathaniel spoke again, quieter this time, but no less firm. "You have one chance to walk out of this room without making things considerably worse for yourself, Edmund. Put down the knife, and let the magistrate handle what comes next. Or don't, and explain to Judge Bellamy why a man already facing serious charges chose to add an armed confrontation to the list." The room held its breath. Edmund's hand shook around the blade, his eyes moving once more between Clara, Margaret, and the steady, unwavering aim of Nathaniel's pistol, searching for an opening that clearly wasn't there. Something in his posture began to fold, the desperate bravado of a cornered man giving way slowly to the plain reality that he had nowhere left to run and no advantage left to use. "You think this ends cleanly for you either way," Edmund said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier edge. "A duke and a gentleman's daughter playing at a fairy-tale rescue while I rot in a cell. You'll tell people it was always real, won't you? That kiss, that engagement. You'll let them believe it was never anything but convenient timing dressed up as devotion." Clara felt Nathaniel go very still beside her, though his pistol never wavered. "Whatever it was at the start," Nathaniel said, "it isn't your concern any longer, Edmund. Put the knife down." For a moment longer, Edmund hesitated, and then, all at once, the fight seemed to drain out of him entirely. He set the blade down on the nearby table with a small, defeated clatter and stepped back, his shoulders slumping under the weight of everything he'd lost in the span of a few short weeks. Margaret moved quickly to Clara's side, pulling her into a tight, trembling embrace, while Nathaniel kept his pistol trained on Edmund until the household staff, alerted at last by the commotion, arrived with rope enough to secure him until the magistrate's men could take proper custody. Judge Bellamy arrived within the hour, and Edmund Blackwood was led away in restraints, his earlier threats and schemes finally catching up to him in a manner far more permanent than any rumor he'd once tried to spread. The formal charges, once the full account of the study confrontation was added to the existing warrant, ensured he would not trouble the county, or Clara, or anyone else in it, for a very long time. The house settled into an uneasy quiet once the magistrate's men departed, the household guard tended to by the estate's physician, Margaret retreating to her room to recover from the fright in whatever solitude she could manage. Clara remained in the study long after everyone else had gone, staring at the empty space on the table where the blade had rested only an hour before, her hands still faintly trembling despite the danger having passed. Nathaniel found her there as the evening light began to fade through the tall windows, his own composure finally cracking now that the immediate crisis no longer demanded. He held it together for everyone else's sake. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing the room to stand near her. "No," Clara said, frightened but not hurt. "I should have anticipated he'd go after your mother once he realized the investigation had turned against him. I was too focused on protecting you directly. I didn't consider he might strike somewhere else to draw us both out." "You couldn't have known," Clara said, echoing the words he'd once offered her about Edmund's true character weeks before. "None of us could have predicted he'd go this far." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, though Clara suspected he wasn't really seeing anything in the room at all. What he said, before he put the knife down, about the engagement being nothing more than convenient timing. Clara's chest tightened. She had been trying not to think about those words since the moment they'd left Edmund's mouth. Too raw and too close to a question she hadn't allowed herself to ask directly, not with everything else demanding her attention over the past weeks. Was he wrong? She asked quietly, needing to hear the answer even though some part of her feared what it might be. Nathaniel turned to face her fully, and for the first time since that first night behind the hedge, she saw something entirely unguarded cross his expression. None of the careful calculation he usually kept close, none of the practiced composure that had carried them both through every crisis since. "It started as convenience," he admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise. I saw a way to stop Edmund from destroying your reputation, and I took it without much thought beyond that immediate purpose. And now I find I've spent every day since that night finding reasons to be near you that have very little to do with managing a fabricated engagement, and everything to do with the fact that I don't particularly want it to end the way we originally planned." Clara's breath caught. The weight of the past weeks, the fear and the danger, and the careful performance of devotion they'd maintained for an audience neither of them had chosen. All of it settling suddenly into something far simpler than she'd allowed herself to consider until this exact moment. "I thought I was only agreeing to protect my name," she said. "I didn't expect to actually care what happened between us, beyond whatever story we needed the county to believe." "And now?" Nathaniel asked, echoing her own question back to her. "Now I find myself in the strange position of hoping you meant what you said in Judge Bellamy's office, when you told him this wasn't only about managing a scandal any longer." A small, genuine smile broke across Nathaniel's face, the first real one Clara had seen from him since the whole ordeal began. "I meant it, every word." The engagement that had started as a desperate lie in the dark of a garden hedge, built to shield her from one man's cruelty, and cemented through the danger of another man's obsession, no longer felt like a story either of them needed to end quietly once the gossip faded. It felt, standing there in the fading evening light with the worst of the danger finally behind them, like something worth choosing honestly, without the excuse of scandal or rescue standing between them any longer. In the weeks that followed, as Edmund Blackwood's trial proceeded, and the county slowly absorbed the full, true account of everything that had happened, Clara found herself no longer dreading the whispers that once followed her name through every drawing room and garden party. The story the county told now was closer to the truth than the one Edmund had tried to force into existence, a story of genuine courage rather than convenient scandal, though Clara knew better than anyone how close it had come to becoming something else entirely. Samuel Ferris and Peter Doyle, whose honesty had proven essential to the case against Edmund, both received Nathaniel's quiet gratitude in the form of generous compensation for the risk they'd taken in coming forward. Mr. Higgins continued to run the Everleigh estate with the same steady efficiency that had helped uncover the truth when it mattered most, and Margaret Whitfield, though she never fully lost the wariness that came from watching a man hold a blade in her own study, found genuine warmth for the Duke who had ridden hard to protect her family when it counted. On a quiet afternoon several months later, in the same garden where the entire ordeal had first begun, Nathaniel asked Clara properly this time. Without an audience to perform for, without a scandal demanding an immediate answer, whether she would consider making the engagement real in truth as well as in name. Clara, standing in the same spot where Edmund Blackwood had once gripped her wrist too tightly, where Nathaniel had once kissed her only to stop a lie from taking root, found she no longer needed to weigh the practical calculations of reputation or convenience at all. She said yes, simply and honestly, because for the first time since that first frightening night, the choice belonged entirely to her, made freely, with no hedge to hide behind and no danger left to outrun. The kiss that followed was nothing like the first. It was slow and certain and entirely their own, unwitnessed by any terrace full of curious guests, needing no explanation and no performance to justify it. It was simply, finally, exactly what it appeared to be.